Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the horrifying case of the Miller family and the mine where dozens of children were found trapped that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder. Don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. On a cool autumn morning in 1847, deep in the coal-rich hills of eastern Pennsylvania, a truth was brought to light. A truth that would not only redefine the limits of human cruelty, but also cast a haunting question upon the conscience of an entire nation. This was not a tragic mining accident, a common misfortune in this land. This was something else, something calculated, concealed, and more sinister than any tunnel collapse or methane explosion. When the first rescuers broke down the rotten door of the Miller family's private mine, a small, unremarkable operation on the outskirts of Ashburg, they were prepared for the worst. But what greeted them surpassed even the darkest imagination. The air was thick, reeking of damp earth, of despair, and of life confined for far too long. Under the dim, flickering light of lanterns, dozens of small figures recoiled into the shadows. They were children, ranging in age from 5 to 15, emaciated to the bone, their entire bodies covered in a layer of black coal dust so thick that in the dim light, they almost seemed to be part of the mine itself. When gentle voices coaxed them toward the light, the children could only squint, shielding their gaunt faces with bony hands. Years of living in eternal darkness had made them fear the very dawn. Most were silent, the silence of a trauma too deep, too horrific to be put into words. But a few, through dry, cracked lips, managed to utter a few words. It was not a cry for help, not the names of their parents. Amidst choked sobs, they whispered a single name, a title that should have been a symbol of protection and love. Papa Miller. That name, repeated like a soulless mantra, caused the most hardened miners, men accustomed to death and danger, to stop in their tracks and then break down in tears. The Schuylkill County Sheriff's Report, a document buried in the courthouse archives for over a century, described scenes so shocking they defied the very language of official record. How could a father become a jailer? How could a family home conceal a living hell right under the feet of an unsuspecting community? To find the answer to that question, we must step back. We must look at the very world that allowed such a nightmare to take root and grow in secret for nearly 2 decades. The town of Ashburg, Pennsylvania, in the 1840s was a vivid portrait of contrast. On one hand, it was a typical coal mining community where traditional values of family, faith, and solidarity were held in high esteem. Life here was harsh and simple. By day, the air echoed with the rhythmic thud of pickaxes and the distant rumble of coal carts on the hillsides. By night, the valley fell silent, save for the faint glow of oil lamps in a few windows and the stars glittering above the black slag heaps. Everyone knew each other, shared the dangers of the mines, prayed together in the small Methodist chapel, and joined hands to help the widows and orphans left behind after every accident. Compassion and mutual trust were the very glue that held this community together. Town gossip was usually limited to minor squabbles or the news of a new baby. though some still spoke in hushed tones of the traveling peddler who had vanished a year prior, last seen heading down the path that led past the Miller property. But on the other hand, Ashburg and the entire eastern region of Pennsylvania were being swept up in the vortex of the Industrial Revolution. The demand for anthracite coal, the black diamonds that fueled America's factories, railroads, and ironworks was booming. This rush for wealth created a ruthless economy where profit was often placed above human value. In this context, the most vulnerable children, orphans, children of poor immigrant families fleeing famine in Europe, or runaways, became invisible ghosts. They could easily disappear from the social fabric without anyone asking questions. They were a source of cheap labor, beings to be exploited to the point of exhaustion without consequence. It was on this fertile ground of industrial greed and communal innocence that the tragedy of the Miller mine was sown. And right at the edge of that world, on a somewhat secluded parcel of land, nestled in a small hollow at the foot of a densely wooded ridge, stood the Miller family farm. Its isolation was near perfect, far enough to avoid prying eyes, yet close enough to maintain a facade of normalcy. On humid nights, those living downwind would sometimes catch a strange, unpleasant odor carried on the breeze, dismissing it as mine damp or a dead animal in the woods. Their log house looked weathered, its roof sagging and perpetually in need of repair. A small barn, a few sheds, and a struggling vegetable garden. Everything was coated in a fine, eternal layer of coal dust. To any passerby, this was merely the homestead of a diligent mining family, trying to make a living from their own small coal seam. But the centerpiece of the property, the thing that defined its existence, was a dark portal, braced by old oak beams, gaping open from the hillside just behind the barn. That was the entrance to the Miller family mine, a perfect stage, hidden from the outside world, ready for a horrific drama to be performed in the dark. In the eyes of the people of Ashburg, Jacob Miller was the embodiment of the era's most respectable virtues. He had come to Schuylkill County as a young man in the late 1820s and, through determination and resourcefulness, had built his own mining operation. Though slight in stature, Jacob was wiry and tough, a man forged by years of swinging a pickaxe. He was an active member of the church, a good neighbor, always willing to contribute coal to heat the chapel in winter or help re-roof the schoolhouse. His resonant baritone voice often led the congregation in hymns every Sunday morning. His wife, Margaret, was a quiet, gentle-looking woman who often brought bread and stew to the families of struggling miners. Though some townsfolk noticed she had a nervous habit of wringing her hands in her apron, her eyes constantly darting towards the woods behind her home as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. They had 2 children, Oliver and Francis, while Frances was quiet and kept to herself. Their teenage son Oliver was developing a reputation for a certain coldness. He had been seen once kicking a stray dog with a chilling lack of emotion, and spoke of the poor with a disdain that was unsettling. On the surface, they were the very picture of a model American family, God-fearing, hard-working, and community-oriented. This facade was not just perfect, it was convincing. Jacob Miller had built a fortress of reputation and kindness, a wall that no suspicion could easily penetrate. However, from the very beginning, small cracks appeared on that perfect surface, anomalies that, if viewed in isolation, could be easily dismissed, but when pieced together, painted a disturbing picture. First was the output of the Miller mine. Other independent miners in the region, with a few hired hands, could barely extract a ton or 2 of coal per day, but Miller's wagons always seemed to be full. At O'Malley's Tavern, miners would sometimes joke about it over ale. "It's like Jacob's got little moles digging for him," one might say. finding seams in places no full-grown man could fit. The joke would be met with laughter, but it hung in the air with a strange, ironic weight by the 1840s. His prosperity became conspicuously disproportionate. Thomas Bell, the proprietor of Henderson's General Store in Ashburg, would later recount that Jacob Miller came in every week to purchase supplies in quantities that made no sense for a family of 4. 50 pounds of flour, half a dozen sides of salt pork, bushels of potatoes, and a great deal of medicine, especially laudanum and tonics. Bell also noted Jacob's unusual interest in certain herbs known to suppress coughs and induce deep sleep, which Jacob claimed were for the delicate constitutions of his city-bred apprentices. When asked, Jacob always had a ready explanation. The work in the mine was so taxing, he said, that his hired men suffered from constant aches and fevers, requiring a steady stock of medicine. The large amount of food was to feed the apprentice boys he was taking in to teach the trade. This explanation, rather than arousing suspicion, earned Jacob praise in an era when orphans and the destitute roamed the streets. For a good man like Miller to take them in and teach them a skill was seen as a noble act of charity. Reverend John Whitfield even publicly commended the Millers' Christian kindness during a Sunday sermon. Jacob was clever in maintaining this narrative. He was always vague about the exact number of apprentices, saying they were a couple of strapping lads from the city, hard workers, but shy around strangers. And then there were the glimpses and whispers, brief, strange moments when the curtain of secrecy was momentarily lifted. Miss Lydia Clark, the pastor's wife, recalled a summer afternoon in 1845 when she brought a pie to the Miller home. While chatting with Margaret, she noticed a thin, grimy-faced boy peeking around the corner of the barn. When she waved and smiled, the child vanished like a spooked fawn. Margaret calmly explained that he was one of the orphans, saying, "The poor thing isn't used to gentlefolk." That explanation, offered with a practiced, mournful smile, was enough to extinguish Mrs. Clark's curiosity. Another time, a hunter's dog that had chased a rabbit onto the Miller property returned to its owner an hour later, whimpering and trembling, refusing to eat and cowering for days. A farmer's wife, foraging for berries along the ridge, swore she heard the faint melody of a child singing a sorrowful lullaby from the direction of the mine. A sound that was abruptly cut off, down by the creek that flowed from Miller's land. A child found the small, crudely carved wooden bird, unlike anything the local children made, and once a man walking the path saw a heartbreaking image scratched in the dirt, a small face with a single tear. Before he could ponder it, a wagon from the Miller property rumbled past, and the image was gone, erased by the wheel. These children, these nameless phantoms, were never seen in town, never attended church. They existed only in the Miller's stories, and in these fleeting, unsettling fragments, stories the community was willing to believe, because believing in the goodness of a neighbor was far easier than confronting an unimaginable truth. The fragile trust of the community, already strained by these unsettling fragments, was destined to be tested by more direct, more chilling encounters. The first of these pivotal events arrived with the unforgiving fury of a Pennsylvania winter. On the 22nd of January, 1847, a ferocious nor'easter descended upon Schuylkill County, burying the landscape under a thick blanket of snow and turning the roads into impassable corridors of white. It was on this night that a traveling Methodist preacher named Elias Wharton, making his way from Pottsville to a smaller village to the west, found himself caught in the blizzard's blinding grip. Half frozen and desperate, the nearest light he could find flickering through the swirling snow was from the windows of the Miller homestead. To his credit, Jacob Miller did not turn the preacher away, despite an obvious unease at the unexpected arrival. He welcomed Reverend Wharton inside, offering a place by the hearth and a share of their meager stew. Yet, as Wharton would later recount in a detailed written statement, the atmosphere within the house was thick with a tension that went beyond mere inconvenience. I sensed a strain in the household that I initially attributed to my untimely intrusion, he wrote. Mr. Miller's hands trembled as he ladled soup, and his eyes darted frequently toward the window, as if watching for something in the storm. Margaret Miller was polite, but visibly nervous, insisting that their guest bed down on a cot in the parlor rather than in the spare room, which she claimed was too draughty, though it was nearer the cellar and the warmth of the foundation. Grateful for any shelter, the preacher did not question this odd hospitality. However, in the dead of that silent, snow-muffled night, Reverend Wharton was awakened by a sound that was both faint and unmistakable through the floorboards beneath his cot. He heard the muffled cries of children. It was brief, just a few sobs, quickly hushed, but in the profound stillness of the winter storm. The sound was jarring and deeply disturbing. Wharton held his breath, listening intently, but heard nothing further. Only the mournful howl of the wind outside. In the morning, as the storm began to subside, the preacher delicately broached the subject. He mentioned to Jacob that he believed he had heard a child's cry in the night. Jacob Miller's demeanor, which had been cautiously courteous, instantly hardened. He offered a short, strained chuckle and explained curtly that the wind often whipped through the old mine shafts beneath the property, producing eerie, wailing noises. "This old house plays tricks on the ears in a storm, Reverend," Jacob added, his smile failing to reach his eyes. Margaret chimed in softly, blaming the weather for making the house creak. When pressed again about children, Jacob admitted to having a couple of apprentice boys on the property, but claimed they slept in a loft above the barn, far from the main house. The explanation was plausible. Yet Wharton, a man accustomed to reading the souls of his congregation, saw in Jacob's eyes the unmistakable look of a man living in profound fear. The preacher departed that morning with a deep sense of unease, a chilling memory he would carry with him, never suspecting he had spent a night mere feet above a chamber of unimaginable suffering. As the snows of winter thawed, the anxieties of the community took on a new, more tangible form. In early July of 1847, the O'Neill family, Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine, were passing through the county during a chaotic wagon transfer near Ashburg. Their youngest son, a spirited 12-year-old with bright red hair named Patrick, became separated from his family. Panic ensued. The O'Neills, their calls growing hoarse with desperation, searched the woods and canal paths for days. A local farmer recalled seeing a boy matching Patrick's description walking alone near dusk, heading in the general direction of the Miller property. A search party was formed, and in a display of calculated goodwill, Jacob Miller himself joined the effort for an afternoon, trudging through the woods with a lantern alongside the other volunteers. He offered words of sympathy to the distraught parents, all the while carefully steering the search away from the vicinity of his mine. After a week of fruitless effort, the consensus was that young Patrick had likely succumbed to the elements or drowned in the canal, with hearts shattered by loss. The O'Neill family eventually moved on, a permanent shadow cast over their new life in America. They would only learn much later that their son had not perished in the wilderness, but had met a cruel fate at the hands of the very man who pretended to help search for him. The threads of suspicion, invisible to the town as a whole, began to draw tighter through the clinical observations of Dr. Horace Middleton, the traveling physician who serviced the scattered communities of the region. His visits to the Miller home, documented in his personal logs, became crucial pieces of the horrifying puzzle. The first was in 1842, when Margaret Miller had supposedly fallen ill with a severe lung infection. As the doctor administered laudanum to calm her cough, he was struck by odd sounds from beneath the floorboards. It was a faint coughing and wheezing, he later testified, almost like that of a child's. When he inquired, Jacob swiftly and plausibly explained that one of the orphan apprentices had contracted the same lung fever and was being kept in a cellar room to prevent the illness from spreading. The explanation, while unusual, seemed to prioritize safety. Another visit in late 1845 to treat Jacob's son Oliver for a leg injury ended with an even more unsettling image. Glancing out a back window, Dr. Middleton saw a pair of small, terrified eyes watching from a crack in the woodshed door. The eyes vanished the instant they were seen. When the doctor made a polite remark about one of the helpers, Jacob's reaction was unusually tense. He muttered something about the boy being frightened of strangers and promptly moved to block the doctor's line of sight. Middleton left on both occasions with an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite pinpoint, a sense that more souls resided on that farm than were ever seen. Such was the power of Jacob Miller's carefully constructed facade that even a man of science, faced with evidence that defied simple explanation, found ways to rationalize his doubts. Attributing the strangeness to the understandable caution of orphans who had led hard lives, the community, too, was caught in this web of rationalization. They saw the individual threads, the excessive purchases, the phantom children, the late-night noises, but the image of the God-fearing, community-oriented Jacob Miller was too strong, too comforting, to allow them to weave those threads together into the terrifying tapestry they truly formed. The final, catastrophic unraveling of this collective denial began on the evening of August 16th, 1847. The oppressive heat of the day had given way to a cool, breezy night, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows through the pines. Thomas Jenkins, a veteran Welsh miner whose small homestead was the nearest to the Miller property, was returning home late. As he walked the moonlit trail along the ridge, a sound made him freeze in his tracks. It was the sound of children's voices, but these were not the playful shouts of twilight games. These were high-pitched, panicked screams and sobs, echoing faintly through the trees with a chilling clarity. They seemed to emanate from beneath him, as if rising from the very ground itself. Holding his breath, Jenkins crept off the trail, moving silently toward the source of the cries. Concealing himself behind a thicket of rhododendron, he saw a scene that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. There, at the yawning black entrance of the Miller mine, illuminated by the stark, lonely light of a single lantern, stood Jacob Miller. His stout frame was silhouetted against the glow, his posture rigid with fury, though Jenkins could not make out the words. Miller's tone was one of furious, guttural command, directed into the darkness of the mine shaft. The pitiful cries of children answered him from within, joined by a pleading wail that was cut short. Then, to Jenkins's utter astonishment, he saw Jacob Miller reach down and haul something or someone up from the darkness. A small figure, light enough to be lifted with one hand, struggled at the end of Jacob's outstretched arm. Even in the poor light, Jenkins could discern the flailing limbs of a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, kicking and screaming in pure terror. In one swift, brutal motion, Jacob clamped a hand over the child's mouth, silencing the scream, and carried him roughly back into the mine, disappearing into the absolute blackness. The cries were abruptly cut off, as if a heavy door had been slammed shut deep within the earth. For a long moment, Thomas Jenkins remained frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He had just witnessed not an act of harsh discipline, but one of violent, terrifying imprisonment. The choice before him was stark: confront a man clearly in the midst of a monstrous act, or run. Or Jenkins chose to retreat, melting back into the shadows. His mind was racing as he ran, a man now tasked with a singular, desperate purpose to bring the law and the light into that unspeakable darkness. By the next morning, Thomas Jenkins's frantic report had spread like a fever through the key figures of Ashburg. At first, there was disbelief. The Jacob Miller, they knew the man who shared coffee at the general store, who led hymns in a resonant baritone, who donated coal to the poor, could not be the monster Jenkins described. Explanations were floated. Perhaps the orphans in Miller's care were unruly, and Jacob had simply disciplined them harshly. Perhaps Jenkins, weary from a long day, had misinterpreted shadows and sounds in darkness. But Jenkins was adamant, his face pale and his hands still trembling from the horror of what he had witnessed. "There are children screaming in that mine," he insisted to anyone who would listen, his genuine terror slowly eroding the wall of their denial. His account became a terrible lens, bringing into focus all the disparate, unsettling details that had been individually dismissed for years. Mrs. Clark remembered the furtive orphan in the barn. Dr. Middleton recalled the phantom coughing under the floor. All these small pieces now formed a mosaic of horrifying possibility. The duty of confronting this possibility fell to Sheriff Nathaniel Bowman, a veteran lawman who had served Schuylkill County for over a decade. Bowman struggled to reconcile the allegations with the man he thought he knew, but his duty was clear. On the dawn of August 17th, 1847, he deputized 2 trusted men and rode out toward the Miller property. The morning mist clinging to the valley floor, Jacob Miller greeted them on his doorstep with a mask of calm, feigning surprise at the unannounced visit. But as Sheriff Bowman explained that they had received reports of disturbances and needed to look around. The sheriff noted a flicker of pure panic in Jacob's eyes, quickly masked by a courteous smile. The conversation began politely in the parlor, where the morning light sliced through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point and accuse. Jacob chuckled nervously and repeated the well-rehearsed explanation of wind in the mine shafts. When asked about the apprentices, he claimed, with a sigh of feigned regret, that they were no longer there, one sent to a cousin's farm, another having run away. As the sheriff's team pressed gently, Jacob grew visibly agitated. It was then that Deputy Taylor, silently scanning the property as they walked outside, noticed the first piece of hard, irrefutable evidence. The heavy wooden doors of the root cellar were secured not with one padlock, but with 3 thick, rusted padlocks along a heavy chain. This was far more security than any man would need for potatoes and preserves. More disturbing still were the deep scratch marks gouged into the wood around the edges of the doors. And in the soft earth nearby, what looked like the faint imprint of a tiny hand in the grain of the wooden frame. Taylor's sharp eyes picked out a dark, dried stain. It was blood. He beckoned the sheriff over, and as Bowman's gaze fell upon the marks, his jaw tightened. Any remaining doubt evaporated. They realized with a dawning, sickening horror that they were standing above a prison, that someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. Bowman changed tactics. He stopped, his voice now stripped of all pleasantry, and commanded, "Jacob, unlock these cellar doors, now!" Miller's composure finally shattered. He stammered, claiming the shafts were unstable, that it was too dangerous. But at that tense, silent moment, a sound drifted up from the very ground on which they stood. It was faint, a mere whisper of sound, but it was unmistakable. Child's weak, quavering voice calling, "Help! Please! Help us! For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, all at once, the lawmen sprang into action. With a pry bar from the barn, Deputy Taylor splintered the old doors, snapping the locks with a metallic shriek. What greeted them was a stench so overwhelming that the men recoiled instinctively, a foul wave of damp earth, human waste, and something far worse. A smell Sheriff Bowman would later describe as the scent of despair itself. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, the full heart-stopping horror was revealed. The cellar had been expanded, connected directly to the mine tunnels, and huddled against the stone walls were children, dozens of them. Some were chained to iron rings set into the wall, the cuffs having rubbed their small ankles raw and bloody. Others, too young or too broken to be a flight risk, huddled together, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a flicker of hope. They were filthy, emaciated, wearing tattered rags that barely clung to their frames. The deputy's lantern light caught the glint of dozens of pairs of eyes, staring up from a hell that had, until this moment, existed only in darkness. "Dear God in heaven," the sheriff breathed, the exclamation escaping before he could compose himself. As the first children were carried out into the daylight they had not seen in years, a deeper exploration of the mine commenced. What they found in the bowels of the earth defied belief. Jacob had carved out a maze of secret chambers. In one, they found older teenagers, still working a coal seam out of sheer conditioned fear, their movements robotic and lifeless. In another, a makeshift infirmary with blood-stained bandages and bottles of laudanum suggested a cruel calculus: treat the children just enough to keep them productive. The most horrific discovery was a small punishment cell, a low dugout cavity where a single, unconscious boy of about 10 was found lying in his own filth, left to die in solitary confinement. And deeper still, in a collapsed section of the mine, they found the shallow graves, the remains of at least a dozen children, hastily buried. Were uncovered the final, silent victims of Miller's secret regime. The ultimate confession, however, was not found in the earth, but on paper, in Jacob's desk. They discovered a worn, leather-bound ledger. In his own cramped, meticulous handwriting, it catalogued the unspeakable commerce. It listed names, or sometimes just crude descriptions. Fella Orphanage, bought of P. Moran, NYC docks, Patty, took in from road. Beside each entry were notes on their fate. Died Ma 41 lung, sold to H. Black VA, Oct. 44. And most chillingly, punished, escaped, deceased, July 47. The ledger revealed a hidden economy of child trafficking, with prices ranging from $10 to $50 per child. It was the cold, hard proof that this was not madness, but a business. The reaction in Ashburg was a volatile mixture of shock, fury, and profound collective guilt. As child after child was carried from the mine, the townsfolk who had once tipped their caps to Jacob Miller now looked at him with such hatred that the sheriff had to station a guard to prevent an immediate lynching. Jacob himself had broken down completely. A pathetic, sobbing figure babbling incoherently about money and orders. Margaret was inconsolable, wailing that Jacob had made her do it. The community, grappling with the agonizing question of how did we not see, channeled its horror into action, converting the schoolhouse into a temporary hospital and shelter for the 30 survivors. The trial, held in Pottsville, became a national spectacle. Newspapers blazed headlines like "A Pennsylvania Horror," and the story of the tunnels of lost children captivated and horrified the nation. Abolitionists pointed to the case as proof that slavery wore many faces, even in a free state. The most harrowing testimony came from the children themselves. A 16-year-old girl named Sarah described being lured from an orphanage with promises of a good home, only to be beaten and forced to work. Patrick O'Neill, the red-haired Irish boy, testified about being grabbed from the road by Jacob himself. Their small, brave voices, detailing years of backbreaking labor, starvation, and cruelty, sealed the fate of their captors. The jury's deliberation was swift. In October 1848, Jacob Miller was found guilty on all counts, including 23 counts of murder, and sentenced to death by hanging. His son, Oliver, implicated by the ledger and testimony as an active participant, received the same sentence. Margaret Miller was sentenced to life in prison. A raw, cathartic sound erupted in the courtroom, not merely applause, but a visceral release of communal outrage and grief. The executions, carried out on December 1st, 1848, marked the end of the Miller family's reign of terror. But the story's repercussions were just beginning, spurred by the public outrage. The Pennsylvania legislature began to enact the state's first true child protection laws, specifically targeting labor in mines. The case became a rallying cry for reformers across the country. It was a grim, undeniable testament to the horrors that could fester in the dark corners of a nation obsessed with progress. And it served as a stark reminder that the cost of that progress was sometimes paid by the most innocent and forgotten of souls. The swift justice delivered in the Pottsville courthouse was an end, but it was not a conclusion. For the town of Ashburg, the execution of the Millers was merely the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. The horror had been excised, but the wound it left upon the community's soul was deep and festering. Even Sheriff Bowman, a man hardened by decades of law enforcement, would confess in his later years to sleepless nights, haunted by the sight of those small, chained ankles. He would retire earlier than planned, telling a close friend that he had seen the bottom of the human soul in that mine and could no longer look at his fellow man without a flicker of suspicion. The question that would torment Ashburg for generations had already begun to form on the lips of its people. How could a rot so profound have grown in their very soil, nurtured by their own trust and willful ignorance? This collective guilt became the catalyst for an extraordinary, desperate act of communal redemption. The town that had been blind now dedicated itself to helping the survivors see a future. The physical and psychological scars borne by the 30 rescued children were staggering. Dr. Middleton, coordinating with physicians from Pottsville, worked tirelessly. One 9-year-old girl named Elsie, who had been underground for at least 2 years, had almost completely lost the use of her legs from untreated fractures and rickets. She would need crutches for the rest of her life. A boy, Samuel, about 11, was found to be nearly blind, his sight ravaged by a combination of vitamin deficiency and years spent in absolute darkness. But beyond the broken bones and failing eyes were the shattered spirits. One quiet boy was found clutching a piece of slate, on which he had scratched a crude image of the sun, a secret act of defiance and memory kept hidden in the dark. Many of the children were nonverbal for weeks, communicating only through whimpers or vacant stares. Some recoiled from a gentle touch, associating any contact with the brutalities of the Millers. For months, the simple act of receiving a piece of bread without having to work for it was a concept so foreign it brought them to tears. The younger ones, in a heartbreaking display of Stockholm Syndrome, still cried out for Papa Miller in their nightmares. Tragically, not all would escape the mine's shadow. A boy named Thomas, rescued at age 14, would take his own life a decade later, unable to silence the echoes of the darkness. In response, the people of Ashburg poured their shame and sorrow into a fund. Monies donated from church groups, miners' unions, and even sympathetic strangers from other states. This fund, managed by a committee led by Reverend Whitfield himself, became a permanent institution in Ashburg, a quiet testament to the town's vow to never again fail its most vulnerable. It paid for medical treatments, schooling, and housing. Local women, who had once praised Margaret Miller's charity, now volunteered day and night, bathing the children, feeding them broth, and simply sitting with them through the terrors of the night. In the months that followed, miracles began to bloom amidst the ruins. Patrick O'Neill's parents, tracked down by a persistent journalist from the Philadelphia Public Ledger who refused to let the boy's story end in tragedy, were brought to Ashburg for a tearful reunion that was like a sunrise after a long, dark night. A few of the youngest orphans were formally adopted by local couples. The little girl, Elsie, once unable to walk, was taken in by the Clark family, the pastor's own, and was raised with a tenderness that slowly began to mend her broken body and spirit. In 1849, in a solemn ceremony, the community sealed the mine for good. The main shaft and the cellar entrance were filled with rock and mortar, entombing the evil within. A simple wooden cross was erected on the site, its plaque bearing no names, for many of the dead were unknown, but a simple inscription, "In memory of the lost children, found 1847, rest now in light." This ceremony became an annual town tradition, a day of quiet remembrance held every August 17th. It was a somber affair, with no speeches, only the silent gathering of families who would lay wildflowers on the stone marker. A collective act of penance, ensuring that the lessons of their past blindness would never be forgotten. Over time, the wooden cross would rot and be replaced by a more permanent stone marker, and nature would reclaim the scarred land. For years, the Miller homestead itself stood empty and derelict, a shunned landmark that local children whispered was haunted by the cries of ghosts, until the town finally petitioned to have it burned to the ground, erasing the physical structure but not its memory. But the legacy of the mine was not so easily buried. For the survivors, it was a shadow that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Yet, in some, that shadow was transformed into a source of incredible strength. Rebecca, the brave teenage girl who had testified at the trial, was taken in by a Quaker family near Philadelphia. Inspired by the compassion she received, she later became one of the first women in Pennsylvania to attend a new teachers' college, dedicating her life to educating poor and orphaned children. She was known for her fierce protectiveness and for always ensuring her classroom had large, bright windows, a stark contrast to the darkness that had stolen her own youth. Samuel, the boy who had been nearly blind, recovered some of his sight. He learned the trade of printing and eventually worked for a newspaper where, in a twist of profound irony, he would proofread editorials praising the very reforms his own suffering had helped bring about. But not every story had such a hopeful arc. Many of the survivors struggled with chronic illness and night terrors. The miller's own daughter, Frances, though cleared of wrongdoing, was unable to escape the stigma. She changed her name and moved west, living a life of quiet seclusion, forever haunted by the name she could never truly leave behind. It was said she never married or had children, as if terrified of passing on a legacy tainted by such profound evil. And then there were the lingering, unanswered questions, the deepest, most unsettling secrets of the ledger. During the trial, the worn, leather-bound book was presented as evidence, its pages passed among the horrified jurors, its cold, calculated entries sealing the fate of the accused more effectively than any testimony. What of the children sold to H. Black, VA, or the two girls delivered as a special order? The full extent of Jacob Miller's network was never completely uncovered, leaving the ghosts of an unknown number of children scattered across the country, their fates lost to history. The ledger itself was eventually archived by the state, its pages brittle, the ink faded, but its cold entries serving as a permanent, chilling indictment of a business built on stolen lives. This uncertainty became part of the mine's haunting legacy, a reminder that while a battle had been won in Ashburg, the war against such darkness was far from over. The term Miller's children entered the local lexicon, a whispered warning to future generations about the monsters that can wear a neighbor's face. Ultimately, the story of the Miller family mine forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil. It is not always a monstrous, otherworldly force that descends upon a community. More often, it is a quiet, insidious weed that grows in the soil of human indifference, greed, and the desperate need to believe in a respectable facade. Jacob Miller was not a demon. He was a man who made a series of monstrous choices, and a community, blinded by its own ideals of trust and piety, allowed him to hide those choices in plain sight. The scandal had a chilling effect on the local economy for a time. Other small, independent mines came under intense scrutiny, and the name Ashburg became synonymous with a terrible secret, a reputation the town fought for decades to overcome. For a generation. To say you were from Ashburg was to invite a somber silence, a look of pity and morbid curiosity. The horror of these crimes, though rooted in the past, continues to challenge us today. News of the case traveled across the Atlantic, where a Parisian newspaper drew grim parallels to the exploited children in Victor Hugo's novels, holding the Miller case up as a uniquely American horror born from unchecked ambition in London. Social reformers used the story in pamphlets, contrasting the supposed liberty of the New World with the slave-like conditions found in its industrial heartland. Would we recognize the signs? In a world of shuttered windows and polite excuses, would we have the courage to ask the difficult questions, to look past the surface of a friendly neighbor? Or would we, too, be lulled by our own desire for a peaceful, orderly world? The story of Ashburg is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it is also a profound and enduring warning. It reminds us that the darkness does not always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it begins with a muffled cry beneath the floorboards, a cry that is all too easy to ignore. The tunnels have been sealed, but the echoes of those lost children resonate through time. They serve as a solemn reminder that we must never stop listening for the whispers in the dark, for it is there that the truth, no matter how unsettling, often waits to be found.